Good afternoon. We are ready to begin our ongoing class on the end times. Just to briefly review, 2 weeks ago, and this is in the notes, 2 weeks ago we discussed why has too much of the Messianic movement been avoiding prophecy, and this morning David Schiller was able to give some teaching about the second coming, not so much on the end times, but more on the significance of how the reality of Yeshua's return is to affect our lives and our walk of faith here on earth. Today, our presentation, The End Times According to Yeshua and His Second Coming, and we're mainly going to be reviewing the material of Matthew chapter 24, and then we're going to get into the rapture debate, which I believe some people are passing around rotten tomatoes. That's what I prefer. We also have some stale bread rolls as well. But we're going to be discussing that today. And then next week, the 20th of November, we'll be talking about realized eschatology, the future breaking into the present. And I'm also giving the Shabbat message, which is tentatively called Today's Messianic Movement, the End Time Move of God, ? And as always, I reserve the right to change the themes because, of course, we're talking about the last days, the end times. We never know what's going to happen. It might all be hitting the fan, and all of a sudden we have to discuss more current event type things. But we're going to do the best that we can. So before we get started, we'll pray, and then we'll get into the material. Heavenly Father, we're very thankful for our time right now as human beings living on this earth. We know that we have probably more questions than we've ever had before regarding when we are, what is happening in terms of your people, what's happening in terms of Israel, what's happening in terms of the Messianic community, and most especially what is happening with us. We know that there's a lot of opinion that is circulating regarding the second coming, the last days, this political entity, that figure, that phenomenon, that particular crisis. I pray that our discussions will be helpful, they'll be constructive, and that you will guide everything that we do and say. In Yeshua's name, amen. Okay, we had some more people come in, so we've got some handouts. They didn't get the handouts. You could help. Okay. Yeah, just a few things. Somebody asked about the first presentation we did on why has too much of the Messianic movement been avoiding prophecy. These teachings are being recorded, and they're available either on the ecdallas.org website or my own website, messianicapologetics.net and .blog, which are listed right here on the sheet. And so this presentation will be posted either this evening or sometime tomorrow with the notes. And also, I featured an article that I wrote a number of years ago called The End Times, What Should We Expect?, which basically goes through the content of Matthew 24, which is what we're going to be mainly discussing today. Okay. The End Times according to Yeshua and His Second Coming. There are many prophetic parts of the Bible that I think garner our attention as it concerns the last days, because after all, David Schiller asked me to do this 3-week series in preparation for a week-by-week analysis of Revelation. So you're being prepared, hopefully, to be aware of some things as you approach Revelation that you weren't necessarily aware of before. Some of the prophetic parts of the Bible that I think really stir our attention would be things like Ezekiel, or Daniel, or Zechariah. 1st and 2nd Thessalonians deals with a lot of the psychology of the end times. How do you approach life issues if the return of Yeshua is the next big thing on God's prophetic timetable? And what is that timetable, and when, and what has happened before, and what does that all involve? And then, of course, we have Revelation. This list is not exhaustive, but these are things that stir everyone's attention, they stir everyone's interest, they stir a lot of conversation. Okay, we got some more people who just came in who need the handout. You're welcome. There you go. Okay, we might actually run out of these. So there are these significant texts of Scripture that get a lot of people's attention. Ezekiel, Daniel, Zechariah, 1st and 2nd Thessalonians dealing with more the on the ground. You believe in the return, but how does that affect you now? And of course, Revelation. The list is not exhaustive. I have heard many times in my life, many times in my ministry experience, people, they hear about the end times, they hear about prophecy, the return of the Lord. What do they say? Well, we'll just deal with that when we get there. I mean, it's like if you were on a road trip going from point A to point B across the country, you wouldn't just say, well, when we get to our destination, we'll worry about that when we get there. I remember making this mistake when I was living in Orlando in the year 2004. And anyone who's been to Orlando, even in like the autumn or fall time, it still can get very hot into the 90s and humid. And I'm thinking to myself, and I knew the next day I was going to have to take a transatlantic flight to London Gatwick. And so I show up at the Orlando airport in short sleeves and, get on the airplane flight. Then I get to London, I get off the plane, and I'm like, what am I wearing? What mistake have I made? I don't even have an undershirt on, and I'm in short sleeves because it was in the 30s outside, and that was after, of course, converting over from Celsius. I'm like, I've made this dumb mistake. And I think a lot of people have that kind of attitude about the last days. They're like, well, we'll just deal with it when we get there. I know we're going there, and when we get there, then I'll have to pull out the map and pull out the guidebook and everything else. And that's not a good idea. But the reason people don't want to go through that exercise is, well, there's no definite way of me being aware of everything that's going to happen. There are things that I just can't know humanly about the last days. And people have said all these things over time, and they've all proven wrong. 88 reasons why he's supposed to return in 1988, and then the sequel, 89 reasons why he's supposed to return in 1989. And all these people, they're making these calculations with numbers, and these people didn't even pass high school math, and I don't even know if they, all of these sorts of ideas that just don't come to pass. And as we discussed last week, the biggest thing nobody wants to say is, I don't know, or I don't know everything. Because we are, whether we want to admit it or not, especially things like Ezekiel and Daniel and Zechariah, these multi-headed beasts. Okay, is that describing aerial drones and black helicopters, or is it describing something else? We are approaching the biblical text as relatively 2- and 3-dimensional mortals, when our eternal God, who operates at a much more multi-dimensional state of being than we do, he's communicating these words to us through ancient prophets, people who, they're connecting to the Almighty. We believe that we are connected to the Almighty through his Spirit, but we still operate in this 3-dimensional world, and God operates at 5, 6, 7, 8, however many dimensions there are. And we're trying to interpret this download from on high, as it were. And people need to be honest. Well, maybe we have some things upside down and backwards. Maybe we don't have all the information that we need to have. And this is especially true when people begin to focus almost exclusively on, well, this beast represents the United Nations. And then all of a sudden, this beast that once represented the United Nations becomes the European Union. And then, because of 9/11 in Afghanistan, this beast now becomes some future Islamic deal, and who knows what it's going to be next. So now I'm not here to say that a lot of that speculation is wrong, but it's speculation. And so, as I have discovered in my time, especially in the Messianic community, which we're going to get into in just a moment, people often don't write all of their prophetic views or prophetic opinions in pencil with a big giant eraser. They, write them, in pen. this is, God showed me that we missed this, and then they end up demonstrating that they didn't have all the information that they should have. And we don't want to discourage people to discuss things, to speculate on things, but we also don't want people to paint themselves into a corner and cry wolf so many times nobody will take them seriously. They pull the handle down on the fire alarm so many times that, like, well, we've gone through this drill before, and then the real thing comes and nobody's paying attention. And indeed, right now, in almost the year 2022, there are things happening, and probably not enough are paying attention. At the very least, God, what's going on here? There are too many things that are scary regarding, travel, regarding health, regarding what's happening with the economy, something called the Great Reset, all of these different matters. So we definitely need to, there's a wide-scale dearth right now of the need to be discussing when are we, and what are some of the things that we need to be anticipating. So as you sort through, we're going to get into Revelation, we're going to get into, all the background of Revelation and Daniel and Ezekiel, and we're going to really hammer this out and figure it out. Okay, and that's great, and that's wonderful. The Nexus passage actually regarding the end times for believers, this central thing that we focus on, is Yeshua's Olivet Discourse, mainly contained to us in Matthew 24. Now, a more abbreviated account is given in Mark chapter 13, which David taught on this morning. But for a lot of people, Matthew 24, those are the end times according to Yeshua. This is, it's no different than how the main theological and spiritual teaching of Yeshua is the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew chapters 5 through 7. So everything else, like Yeshua says, kind of pivots off of that. The same thing is true of the last days. Everything that we as believers in him focused on regarding the last days sort of pivots off of the Olivet Discourse, because while there are signs given to us in the Olivet Discourse, you don't see necessarily, this, four-headed beast coming up out of the earth or out of the sea, or this red dragon with a tail that will sting, or you don't see that kind of symbolism. You see much more concrete things. Deception. You see wars and natural phenomenon, persecution of God's people, believers, false prophets arising. You see more things that are concrete, and while they are general enough warnings to really, get us to be concerned and even a bit fearful at times, they're things that we can be looking out in the world and we can say, yeah, that's happening, and people are being deceived regarding this, and there was a betrayal that took place over there. They are concrete enough that we don't have to be caught completely unaware. Because one of the things that I think is fair to recognize, in the first century, in Second Temple Judaism, there were many expectations of the Jewish community regarding what the Messiah was supposed to do when he arrived. And in fact, most of those expectations were rooted in the Messiah was a political figure. He was going to overthrow the Romans. He was going to reestablish the Davidic monarchy, and all of the exiles would return back to the Promised Land. And of course, that's not what happened. What happened instead is this person, Yeshua, was executed by the Romans, but he was also resurrected from the dead. And so that changed, that reoriented, how do we look at some of these messianic prophecies? And if it were true about Yeshua's first coming, then we need to be honest enough to recognize, maybe there are some things we don't fully understand about the events that will precede or be associated with his second coming. And of course, it's like, okay, John, what are you telling me? All these books that I bought on, over the past 10, 20 years, I need to basically use them when we lose power to, feed the fire. Well, that's up to you. Maybe toilet paper. No, I'm just kidding. You've already got that. You've already got toilet paper. But no, what I'm saying is a lot of people who make very strident assertions about prophecy, they tend to be affected by the current events of the time. Like there are a lot of viewpoints that have come out of Dallas Theological Seminary and other schools of thought that are affected by the Cold War, believe it or not, because that's when some of their conclusions were really being made. And you just have to keep that in mind. It's not as though some of the speculation was off or wrong, but perhaps people needed to be more honest and, well, we don't fully know, but this is what we might think. So we're going to begin by just going through some of these passages. I'm going to make a few observations, and then we have, at the conclusion of the discussion, questions. These are, if you remember 2 weeks ago, these are guideposts, and it'll give you enough time, because this is being recorded, it'll give you enough time to hopefully think through some, really useful questions that we can discuss in a constructive manner, because I know that we all have what's going on right now, and what's happening right now, and am I going to lose my job because of this, and is such and such the mark of the beast, and all that. I know people are asking those questions, and those are important. So we start out in Matthew 24 with Yeshua speaking about intense deception. And Yeshua answered and said to them, "See to it that no one misleads you. For many will come in my name, saying, 'I am the Messiah,' and will mislead many." Now, this is kind of an interesting place to start out the discussion on the last days. Don't be deceived. Don't be misled. And many are going to come in my name, the name of Yeshua, saying, "I am the Messiah," and mislead many. Now, some people are flat going to be saying in the last days, and they're already saying it today, and if you've gone to Israel, you've seen people with Jerusalem syndrome. They believe they are the Messiah. I mean, I am the Messiah. I am, one of the two witnesses of Revelation. I am John the Baptist, whomever. More likely, in my view of this, you are going to see people attest to Yeshua is the Messiah, but they will be responsible for misleading many. So we go into this passage just being told up front, there's going to be intense deception everywhere. So what that means is we need to be plugged into the Lord. We need to be plugged into what God is doing. We need to be praying for wisdom, discernment, the ability to sort through. As I learned many years ago as a political science undergraduate, you have to sort between the data and the noise. And that is one of the most difficult things to do, because most of what you hear out there is noise. But yet there is legitimate data, there is legitimate information to pick through. Yeah. Thank you very much. Okay. So there's going to be intense deception just going into this whole phenomenon of the last days. And I would guess that a lot of the prophecy books and people who have the latest interpretation, it's more noise than it is actual data. But again, the whole point, I think, of the last days is God tests each and every one of us to see how loyal we are to Him, not are we following after someone who simply wants to make a big name for themselves. Moving on, we hear of wars and natural phenomenon. And this is something that I know that this always gets a huge amount of play, particularly if you watch, although I stopped really watching Christian television a very long time ago, especially Total Blasphemy Network. I'm sorry, I mean TBN. I'm sorry. But there's the wars and the natural phenomenon, and these are the kinds of things that Hal Lindsey and Jack Van Impe and some of these others, they always say. And then Rexella, "Oh, Jack, yes, we're so concerned about the left." And but this is the kind of stuff that really sells books. It really gets people going to go buy that 4 year food supply that then within about 3 or 4 months is laden with bugs and everything else. You will be hearing of wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not frightened, for those things must take place, but that is not yet the end. For nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and in various places there will be famines and earthquakes. But these things are merely the beginning of birth pangs. So, people. I wasn't around during the Cuban Missile Crisis, but I have no doubt that there were certain people in the prophecy world who were saying, "This is it. It is all about ready to come down." Well, we are still here. But wars and rumors of wars, there's probably been a lot more wars and rumors of war that the general population doesn't hear about than we would be able to handle. So what are all the back channel communications between people in this government or that government, and they barely stave off there being a major disaster. Those are the things of the Tom Clancy novels. I haven't read a Tom Clancy novel in a long time, but those are the kinds of things that are discussed there. These things have to take place. It's not yet the end. Now, this statement, nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom, a lot of people think those are exactly the same thing, and they are more similar than not. But kingdom against kingdom mainly speaks of political states or political entities going at it in some kind of a war or conflict. And that's how we naturally approach it. We think of all of the wars that are presently going on today that we really don't hear about, but we know they're going on in remote jungles, and we know they're going on online, cyber attacks, that sort of thing. But the thing about nation will rise against nation, it is the Greek term ethnos, which speaks of different ethnic groups, being in conflict with one another. And actually, over the past several years here in America, we have seen that take place. We have seen people wanting to stir up a race war, wanting to stir things up where, okay, there have been injustices committed from one group to another, but is violence the answer when actually it's the good news of Yeshua that's the answer? I mean, that's really the only clear solution to some of these things. And then there's the statements in various places, famines and earthquakes. And I can't tell you how many studies on Matthew 24, the last days, I've sat through where people say, yeah, do you know how many earthquakes there have been in the past 200 years? And my mother, who is a geologist, would say, these earthquakes have been going on for a lot longer than 200 years. It just so happens that we've only been recording them for 200 years. So a lot of these people, these earthquakes, 4 on the Richter scale, 5. No, these things happen all the time. We've just only been really recording them since the whole idea of a Richter scale was invented, and the kind of earthquake that we're looking for is Southern California falls into the sea, or San Francisco disappears all of a sudden, or something like that. All of a sudden there's no more Japan or Hong Kong. That's the kind of earthquake we're looking for. We're looking for the big one around the Ring of Fire in the Pacific. And the question of there will be famines, because I know at least one of you is going to ask in the question and answer, what's the deal with what's been happening the past couple of years, the C word. This might be posted on YouTube, so we have to be careful about that. What's the deal with the C word? And COVID. It's it's the C word. Okay. All right. So somebody asked, "What's the C word?" Okay. But people have been asking, is that because there are a lot of people who I think understandably have been very disturbed about, does this fit into prophecy? And I haven't read all of not the material that's just discussing where did this thing come from and how is it going to be resolved, but is this thing specifically mentioned in prophecy, and is this the deal? But there are people who are like, yeah, this specifically mentioned here or there, but I think more often than not, more people are just seeing this as yet one of these other famines. Wherever it came from and whatever it's intended to do, it is a famine. It's one of these pestilences that we need to be aware of, and it is supposed to get our attention, but we're supposed to approach it reasonably and with the understanding that, okay, God, you're trying to stir us up, you're trying to get our attention. This thing was supposed to be over in March of 2020. It was supposed to be over in 2 or 3 weeks, and here we are. We're going to be going through all of these different variants and everything else. So it's merely the beginning of birth pains. It's just the start of it. And you're like, I don't know. I don't know if we can continue on this, but it gets better. To persecution of believers. Yeah, martyrdom. When was the last time you heard a message on martyrdom? Probably never. Then they will deliver you to tribulation and will kill you, and you will be hated by all nations because of my name. And at that time, many will fall away and will betray one another and hate one another. So, all right. all these bad things are happening. We go in with deception. War is a natural phenomenon. And then this thing about believers in Yeshua being hated, they will be murdered, all because they believe in him. And many will fall away and will betray one another and hate one another. Now, I've seen this apply to, well, this is speaking about how in history you had the Hitler Youth rat on their parents. You had members of the Communist Party, they ratted on their parents. And now you're going to get kids at school today ratting on their parents because they were listening to Rush Limbaugh, or they were supporting the Republican Party, or things like that. That's what I have heard. Or they didn't get the jab. So whatever it is. But these are actually serious things. These are not things that we can take lightly, because if we're getting closer and closer to Yeshua's return, we're going to see these different things. I mean, what would it mean for, and again, some of my poli-sci background, what would it mean if, a certain kid found out that their parents were doing something in the basement that was going to harm other people in society? So, young kids, they're conditioned to think that, well, if my parents are doing something that I'm not learning at school, then I need to inform. And so this is something that, I mean, you just think it involves, the Hitler Youth or the Communist Party, but it involves other things that will seemingly make sense as we get closer to the return of the Lord. But in this case, it's probably going to be, they teach me at school that, Christianity, that the Bible, that Israel, those are bad things. And my parents, they read the Bible every morning and every evening, and they pray to this being that I can't see, this imaginary friend of theirs. Do you think in the future there are going to be kids who turn in their parents or turn in their loved ones because of that? Yeah, I mean, I don't know what they're teaching in school right now. It's been so long, but it's getting scary. False prophets, moving on. Many false prophets will arise and will mislead many. So we're going to be here for the next 4 hours, 6 hours, so get comfortable. We're going to discuss all the false prophets. No, we actually did that last time. But false prophets will arise and mislead many. Now, there are, of course, many ways that this can be applied. Beginning with intense deception in verses 4 and 5 starting out. People making all of these false end-time predictions about, well, I have been commissioned by God as the end-time prophet, and I know that the Lord is returning on date X at such and such an hour, at such and such a minute, and such a second. We've seen all of that before. But I think even more so, this false, because there's so many different ways this can be applied. What kind of deceptions are you going to see in the last days as they involve salvation, as they involve redemption, as they involve the coming of the false Messiah, the coming of the false kingdom, as it were? I know one of the big questions that people are asking right now, and I'm actually going to be mentioning this probably next time more in detail, but a lot of good people in America, a lot of righteous people in America, they're praying, maybe all these bad things are happening. Maybe, all the good guys, in the military and in the government, maybe they're going to finally, make things, right. And, we're going to stop this, before it gets any worse. And look, I believe that, there are good, moral people. They love their country. They see the corruption in the political system. They know there are a lot of secrets out there that will make people very, very angry. They will also shake a lot of people up. But do we want to see those secrets now, or do we want to see those secrets after the return of the Lord, where the Lord is there to hold our hand and explain what's happened in the world? That's a kind of a big question that I don't think people often process. What has brought the world to this point? What has brought the world to this? And a lot of those people, they're good, they're moral, but a number of them are into Spiritism. A number of them are into New Age types of beliefs. A lot of them, they don't adhere to a code of biblical ethics and morality. It's more, well, I just need to get my love vibrations on, or I just need to, plug into the source of the cosmos, and they're into, much more of a new age type of spirituality. And my concern is with that kind of a scenario. Okay, so you flush out all this open evil, open Satan, open, blood drain, all these things that, are really quite disturbing. And then the enemy just takes off his red coat and he puts on his white coat. And then the end time scenario becomes more ethereal, and it becomes more about, love, and, you're intolerant, and, this and that. And that's really, right now, we're having to begin to process what the post-evangelical world is going to, or the post-evangelical religious arena is going to be like. Evangelical Protestantism is an endangered species, if you're unaware of that. It's a number of years ago, I had to go to a family wedding in Williamsburg, Virginia, and it was at this really nice historic church, going back to the colonial era. My cousin and his wife, of course, they were being married, but they are, unashamed liberal Christians. There was not a bridesmaid of honor. There was a groomsman of honor. One of the bridesmaids was dressed in a tuxedo, and really the whole wedding, half of the wedding party was LGBTQ. And it was all, and a lot of people, they just had to like, oh, this is great, they're getting married, and yet some of us who were in the wedding were just like holding onto the rail in the pew and like, when is this going to be over? When is this going to be over? And we're like, I didn't come to a wedding all about gay rights. I came to, but they were making a statement, and they were in this, post-evangelical, they represented this post-evangelical thing that's coming. Love is love. Whether it's two men or two women or multiple or whatever, and Jesus would support abortion because he doesn't want you to go into the back alley and for a woman to be unnecessarily harmed. He wants it to happen in the confines of a hospital facility, and we can take those cells and then we can repurpose them for other things that will help with life. And I mean, it's this really twisted, perverted way of seeing the world, but they're going to be a lot of people who they've got highfalutin seminary PhDs, and they're going to go along with this, and they're going to support this, and you're going to be very, very shocked. One of the things I think, because I know when we look at the 20th century, and I think most people in the Messianic community, all that I know, have said that, what is the tragedy of the 20th century? It's the Holocaust. And then maybe it would be the bomb. It would be the Holocaust. But the real tragedy, I think, isn't just the Holocaust. It's that it wasn't some primitive, unenlightened, uneducated group of people who perpetrated the Holocaust. It was the country that had the most advanced technology, the most advanced philosophy, the most advanced education system in the world. That's the tragedy of the Holocaust, that these enlightened people would actually use their German efficiency to perpetrate it. So, and they would use, and it's not just Germany that was responsible. Believe me, British companies, American companies, they all profited off of it until, the war took place. But that's the real tragedy of the Holocaust. And if it could happen with Germany, it could happen with anyone else as well. And indeed, there are things that are happening right now in the world that are at that same level. So, false prophets, we think, oh, it's just about people making false predictions, just about people saying, all paths lead to God. But there are other things involving, people who will be entering into this post-evangelical that are very, very concerning to me. And we do need to be aware of them. And that'll have to be a discussion for another time, but it's something that is very concerning. Which, of course, leads us to lawlessness. Because lawlessness is increased, most people's love will grow cold. Now, in my ministry experience, I do deal with a lot of Hebrew roots people who are like, yeah, this is talking about the church, and the church, they're not keeping the Sabbath and the feast, and they're eating pork and blah, 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 blah. And it's like, look, with what I've just discussed regarding post-evangelicalism on the way, much of evangelicalism has got very, very bigger. It's got much bigger issues to deal with than those things. Because because to a lot of people, the Tanakh, the Old Testament, they are ancient Israel's campfire stories. They're not even true stories, perhaps. And so, if you don't have any kind of a foundation in that as like legitimate ethics and morality, you can make a lot of things in the Bible basically read whatever you want to read. But the point is, lawlessness is increased. Most people's love will grow cold. So if you don't, as a Bible believer, have an understanding of Torah, prophets, writings, and then the Messianic scriptures, something that builds upon itself, then you won't understand how God has manifested his love, grace, and mercy throughout human history, and you won't be able to extend it in the real circumstances where it's supposed to be extended. So you look at a number of your progressive friends, progressive family members, they try to come across as all tolerant and all inclusive, but really they're not. When you really get down to it, well, I believe this and you believe that, so hopefully we can have a conversation and it can be constructive, and yes, we've got different points of view, but they're the ones who say, no, you don't believe in this, well, I'm not going to tolerate you, and I'm going to go tell that to the bank where you do business and they're going to terminate your account. These are the kinds of things that I know are very disturbing to people. But the one who endures to the end, he will be saved. So endurance, perseverance, we've got to just push through to the end of all of this. We have to know that pressure will continue to mount, but the Lord is looking at, are we going to be able to make it through? Are we going to be able to survive, as it were, to the ultimate conclusion? Now, here's an interesting one, because I know this people who are in evangelistic ministries, they really like to talk about this word from Yeshua. This gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in the whole world as a testimony to all the nations, and then the end will come. So, for example, on a lot of Christian television over the years, I've seen people, we've got to raise so many $1 million to launch our satellite so we can reach the last groups of people who've never even heard of Jesus or the Bible. And I'm not here to say that those are bad things, or we need so much in order to do this or do that. And that's good, because I think there is an element of the good news of the Messiah needs to be declared to the entire world, and then the Lord will return. But here we see a specific reference to this gospel of the kingdom. And what was the question that the apostles asked right before Yeshua ascended into heaven? Lord, is that at this time you are restoring the kingdom to Israel? So I would politely float out to everyone here, especially we're in the Messianic movement here. We focus on Israel, we focus on Jewish outreach, Jewish evangelism. Is the gospel of the kingdom, does it have some association with what we're involved with right now? Does it have some conscious knowledge of, God regathered the Jewish people back to their homeland in Israel, and Yeshua, the Messiah, isn't just returning to planet Earth. He's also returning to Jerusalem. And how do you focus your end-time attention and energies toward that end? How do you get on the Romans 11:26, all Israel will be saved trajectory of history? Is this gospel of the kingdom more involved with some of these elements? Of course, what it means is that, well, as much as we know that the planet at large hasn't often heard of Yeshua of Nazareth, now the planet at large really needs to hear of Yeshua, King of Israel. And again, this is a question we will not be able to address fully today. Now, we've talked about all these different signs: deception, wars, persecution, false prophets, lawlessness, endurance, gospel of the kingdom. And then but these are all general enough. We're like, yeah, I don't know about this, I don't know about that, we'll just have to wait and see. It just keeps, I think the questions that we ask just tend to breed more questions. But then you come to this one point event. And this one point event, actually in some of our family's experiences over the past 25 years, we've seen a lot of predictions made surrounding this. The abomination of desolation. Now, there's some people who believe that this is a past event in history, particularly associated with the destruction of Jerusalem in 70. If you look in Daniel chapter 9, Daniel 9:27 actually speaks of the overspreading of abominations. I believe that's the King James Version rendering. And you have, in the next few weeks, we're going to be commemorating Hanukkah. So we're going to speak of one of those desolations when Antiochus Epiphanes had the pig sacrificed on the altar, the statue of Zeus erected. We have 70, the destruction of Jerusalem, and then later the erection of a temple to Jupiter. And then, of course, a little later, further on, this might not be politically correct, we had the abomination known as the Dome of the Rock. And who's to say we're not also waiting for some future abomination of desolation? So let me read this and then. Therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation, Daniel 9:27, which was spoken of through Daniel the prophet, standing in the holy place, let the reader understand, then those who are in Judea must flee to the mountains. Whoever is on the housetop must not go down to get the things out that are in his house. Whoever is in the field must not turn back to get his cloak, but woe to those who are pregnant and those who are nursing babies in those days. Pray that your flight will not be in the winter or on a Sabbath. So some of those latter expressions, they deal more with the people who are in the vicinity of Jerusalem when this thing takes place. And I still believe that this future abomination of desolation, this is the point event that everyone has to look for. And it involves a cessation of animal sacrifices, the erection of an idol, and the declaration that the false Messiah or Antichrist is the true Messiah, the one true God. This is also detailed in 2 Thessalonians 2, among other places. But over the years, we've seen a lot of people say, now, wait a second. If this abomination of desolation is the point event, how is it going to take place today? Because as to my knowledge and as to your knowledge, there are no sacrifices taking place in Israel on the Temple Mount. I mean, there are Temple Mount faithful groups that perform. First of all, they claim to have all of the vestments, all of the materials that are needed, all the shovels, pans, etc., ready to be involved with a Levitical sacrificial system, and they even have been known to do practice sacrifices, like out near the Dead Sea or that sort of thing. You hear about that, and the whole discussion of, the red calf. We've got the red calf, and we're able to purify get things ready for the priesthood. But ultimately, the question becomes, well, how are they going to do this? There's no temple. And I've seen people come, 2 weeks ago, we mentioned how in 1996, we encountered a teacher who said that the Middle East Peace Accord of 1993 on the Temple Mount, on the White House lawn between Yitzhak Rabin and Yasser Arafat, that initiated the tribulation period. And in March of 1997, the abomination of desolation was going to take place, and people were like, "Well, how's that going to happen? Isn't there going to be a third temple?" And you can't just one of these bounce houses, blow it up at the. They've got to, and then all of a sudden you see people start whittling things down. It's like, okay, what would be a minimal abomination of desolation? Well, surely maybe the temple's not going to be reconstructed. Maybe it'll be, a tabernacle, as existed during the time of King David. It's like, well, okay, that's possible. And then you get closer, like within a couple of days, and you're like, I don't see a tabernacle up there. And then, well, we're just going to have the sacrificial altar, and it only needs to be up and down for 5 minutes. And like, okay, now you've gotten too desperate. Now you've just gotten too, no. I would expect, in order for an abomination of desolation to take place, a sufficient amount of time to pass for animal sacrifices to take place, at the very least, in a tabernacle. I believe that the temple probably will be constructed, but a minimal interpretation, in my view, would require a tabernacle. And today, we don't see any of this taking place at all. So, yes, because we are taping it. So, and this gives people time to think through their questions. So we're not just, what's that? Yes, sir, we will. We're wrapping this up in just a few moments. Subsequent to the abomination of desolation, Then there will be a great tribulation, such as has not occurred since the beginning of the world until now, nor ever will. Unless those days had been cut short, no life would have been saved, but for the sake of the elect, those days will be cut short. Now, there are people who, what does it mean, cut short the days? I've seen some of the days in Revelation, and Daniel referred to, well, that's not exactly the number of days that will exist. I've seen people say, well, actually, it's going to be the length of individual days that is reduced. There's going to be some kind of a comet or asteroid that hits Earth. Well, this doesn't really work well for the flat Earth people, but but anyway, so you're going to see an asteroid hit the Earth, and we're going to start having 10-hour days, and it's going to cause all these problems, and that's going to be responsible for all these earthquakes and volcanoes of Revelation and everything else, and that's how the days are shortened. Ultimately, what we do is we write these down as possibilities, and this is where we do have to wait and find out. And it's also the cause of the darkness and everything else. But I think it is fair to say that the Great Tribulation can't be any longer than what is actually stated as time times and half a time in Daniel. Because if it were any longer, then humanity would indeed be annihilated. Now, as we build our controversy here on Yeshua's Olivet Discourse, there are going to be false expectations. And indeed, that's the reason why today in 2021, 2022, you don't see enough people, even in our own faith community, really talk about the last days. All of these false predictions, it'll happen when it happens. Then if anyone says to you, behold, here is the Messiah, or there he is, do not believe him. For false messiahs and false prophets will arise and will show great signs and wonders, so as to mislead, if possible, even the elect. Behold, I have told you in advance. So if they say to you, behold, he is in the wilderness, do not go out, or behold, he is in the inner rooms, do not believe them. For just as the lightning comes from the east and flashes even to the west, so will the sign of the coming of the Son of Man be. Wherever the corpse is, there the vultures will gather. So the return of the Lord isn't going to be this secretive thing. We're going to get into the rapture in just a moment. But it's not. It's going to be so well known that everyone has to pay attention to it. Lightning from the east to the west. Now, there are going to be false messiahs and false prophets showing signs and wonders. Immediately, if you're not cued into, say, the Egyptian magicians who also performed signs and wonders before the Pharaoh with Moses, pay attention to those kinds of things. Because we read these examples in Scripture so we can identify them when they take place today. One of the biggest debates, I had no idea, one of the biggest debates that's happening in certain Christian groups right now is, can Christians also be witches? Can they also be involved in Wicca on the stuff? I mean, I'm not making this stuff up. My youngest sister, who is in the U.S. Navy, was on a cruise on their ship, on their destroyer, and one of her fellow officers on the USS Farragut was a Wiccan. And I'm like, Wiccan? What? I thought you either believed in God or you were an atheist nowadays. But I guess she was just reading too much Harry Potter. I don't know. But signs and wonders, false messiahs, false prophets, it's all of the above. It's not just this or that. But there are going to be people who say, look, 88 reasons why he's going to return in 1988. Look, you need to come to my place of refuge that I have prepared. You need to come to my compound where I have lemonade waiting for you. Kool-Aid would be too obvious. You need to come. I mean, these are the kinds of things that we've seen. They will repeat themselves. They've been around for quite some time. Growing up in the state of Kentucky, some of you may have heard of the Shaker movement. They were kind of an end-time movement where you joined the Shaker movement, and then if you were a family, the men would live in one set of the compound, the women on the other side of the compound, and then they'd all become brothers and sisters and follow the teachings of Sister Anne, who was, of course, Jesus Christ reincarnated. But really, the reason the Shakers died off was, well, they didn't procreate. And if you had been a married couple and your kids were part of it, and you're like, this isn't, after 2 or 3 years, like, I don't think this is working out. I think we need to move on westward to Texas or something. I think, but these things have been around for quite some time, and they will be around in the days leading up to Yeshua's return. And then we come up to the gathering of the elect, the people of God, and this is where things get really controversial, because it does pertain to, okay, John, this is all great, and you've humored me with some of your anecdotes that, yes, a lot of them are true, unfortunately, regarding religious history and your own experience, and we've all made mistakes regarding when, but this whole rapture debate, this whole second coming debate, because, when is the Lord going to return? Is it going to be pre-trib? Is it going to be post-trib? Is it going to be something like that? Because, I'm going to my congregational leader, and they're not giving me a straight answer, or I'm going online and I just see a bunch of people spitting at the camera, and I know that here we are in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, and we've got we have Dallas Theological Seminary, DTS, in our backyard, which strongly supports a dispensational pre-tribulation rapture theology, meaning that perhaps in the next 5 seconds we could all get beamed out of here, and we get beamed out of here, and then the Jewish people have to go through Holocaust too in order to receive Jesus Christ as their Messiah, so it says. But yet, in the Messianic community, we don't often hear that. We hear people thinking that just as God preserved ancient Israel through the Exodus, the judgments upon Egypt, preserved them through the Red Sea, the wilderness sojourn, and for that same matter, just as he preserved many of the first century believers who walked and talked with Yeshua and yet had to endure terrible hardships, but made it at the end, is that going to be the scenario we have to go through? What does the Bible say about this? And I remember when I was a young child, I went to a Christian elementary school. It was Baptist, it was dispensational, it was also King James only, and they really strong about the pre-tribulation rapture. And we watched, I mentioned this 2 weeks ago, we watched the movie A Thief in the Night from the 70s with, remember the Unite van and the electric razor that was in the sink after the rapture, and then the lady who, the ice cream cone and the stick of butter that was melting and all of this. And so that was really, ingrained in me. And then one of the things that's kind of interesting is in 1995, this is right like weeks before our family started coming into the Messianic community. I was a freshman in high school, and I started out every morning to really dig into the Word, and I started with the Gospel of Matthew, and I did a chapter a day, and then I got to Matthew 24, and then I approached these verses. Immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will fall from the sky, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. And then the sign of the Son of Man will appear in the sky, and then all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of the sky with power and great glory. And he will send forth his angels with a great trumpet, and they will gather together his elect from the four winds, from one end of the sky to the other. And I've got in the notes the intertextual references from the Tanakh or Old Testament listed. When I found this passage for the first time, I thought, oh my goodness, I don't see this any moment beam out in the scriptures. I see, like at the very, very end, God pulls his people out as the final judgments begin to really take place. And being 15 years old at the time, it was 1995. There was not a lot of there was really no internet at the time, so I had to go into my stepfather's library and find as many books as I could on the end times, and I found some things by John Wolvert. I found a book called The Church in the Tribulation by Robert Gundry. I found another one, The Blessed Hope by George Eldon Ladd. I mean, these things were from the 70s. And then I found the Third Millennium Prophecy series, which was a series of novels. So I'm like, okay, well, I'm going to read some fiction. Maybe this is fiction. I don't know here. And that's also when the Left Behind series just started getting released. So I had a lot of information at my disposal. And I remember not only at home announcing to everyone, well, I've seen some of this new information and I am now a post-tribulationist. This is so exciting, I get to be different than everyone. But it's even better than that. So I'm at the Christian school, right? And we're in study hall. And of course the teacher's off, getting coffee or something like that. So we're all like, yeah. And I'm like, hey, guess what I am now? I am a post-tribulationist, And they're like, what's that? And like, well, I think we're going through the tribulation period and where we're just going to endure, against the beast and all this stuff. And like, oh, I can't believe that. Jesus is going to show up as though it's some big, massive surprise party. And I'm like, well, the surprise party mentioned here is probably, I don't like surprises. But it was that kind of, and of course, ninth graders, they know everything. So, but it was at this time, it was kind of interesting. Our whole family made this transition over to a post-tribulational eschatology, and then all of a sudden we get thrust into the Messianic movement and the Messianic experience. So they are innately tied together for me. It's something that's very, very important. And as we're going to be discussing next time, what does this mean for us as a faith community, as a movement? What makes us different than other religious movements which have preceded us? Now, as anyone who's been involved in contemporary debates in theology over the past 50 years knows that huge debate among premillennialists. Now let me specify what a premillennialist is. A premillennialist is someone who believes that Yeshua returns before the 1,000-year millennium. So I think it's safe to say that almost all of us here are premillennialists. Okay, so we believe Yeshua returns before his 1,000-year millennium. So all pre- and post-tribulationists are premillennialists. The real question is in association with that final period of time, whether it's 7 or 3.5 years. Does Yeshua return before that to take the believers away, and then the Jews have to be beaten up, and then they'll submit to Yeshua? Or do we all go through this together, and then we are pulled out at the very last moment? Similar, for example, to how Rahab and her family were pulled out of Jericho right as Jericho was getting ready to be destroyed and to fall. So these things do involve not only biblical proof texts, they also involve ideology. A very, very funny story. When I was at the University of Oklahoma, I took various classes on the big Judaic Studies department up at OU when I was there that was endowed by the Jewish community of Tulsa. A lot of oil money went into that. So we had a Jewish Studies department, and one of the prominent instructors was Professor Norman Stillman. And most of the students he had in his class he knew were big Oklahoma Bible Belt, like the size of a plate, and he was from New York, and he was like, I know why you all are here. You all are trying to convert me to Christianity. I watched Jack Van Impe. I know all about the rapture. I know what you're trying to get me to believe. And the way that he said this is, look, I believe in God, and God delivered the Jewish people through the Exodus. God can deliver us through anything. He got us through the Holocaust. But you people have to be taken out. Your God can't protect you. Your God is impotent. He needs Viagra. I mean, that's what he said about the pre-trib rapture. Your God needs Viagra. That's what I was told. And it was like, that kind of like stopped it right there. It's like, so rather than just say, well, you need to reevaluate whether or not you have an escapist ideology. Yeah, your God's impotent. So, okay. So a lot of Jewish people, when they hear about this, well, you're going to be taken out, and then we got to go through all this again. It can be a deterrent to Jewish outreach and evangelism. Yeah, you wish you were making it up, but you can't. So. Matthew 24, 29 through 31 commonly gets associated, and then we'll close up and we'll have a number of questions, because this is what to me are also important passages associated with immediately after the tribulation of those days. Commonly you'll hear 1 Thessalonians 4, 16 through 18 describing the return of the Lord. The Lord himself will descend from heaven with a shout, with the voice of the archangel, and with the trumpet of God, and the dead in Messiah will rise first. Then we who are alive and remain will be caught up together with them in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air, and so shall we always be with the Lord. Therefore, comfort one another with these words. And it is kind of interesting that the term rendered as meet here, apantesis, appears in the book of Acts, where the believers in Rome go out to meet Paul at the 3 taverns, and then they all return to the city together. So many people conclude, and I'm one of them, that that is what's going to happen when the Lord returns. We go and we meet him in the clouds, these final really bad judgments take place, and then we all return to planet Earth together. Now, more specifically, 1 Corinthians 15, 51, and 52, behold, I tell you a mystery, we will not all sleep, but we will all be changed in a moment, in the twinkling of an eye, at the last trumpet, for the trumpet will sound, and the dead will be raised imperishable, and we will be changed. So this is describing the same event, the resurrection of the dead, the return of the Lord at the last trumpet. So one of the questions I know that does come up is, well, how's the last trumpet, this first trumpet, and then you have the 7 trumpets of Revelation, and how do you separate those two? And that's a debate that does take place. That's something that post-tribulationists point out to pre-tribulationists, and pre-tribulationists say, well, it's just the last trumpet, of this present age or something. And they have to really put that argument out there very strongly and very hardly, because if you look at the 7th trumpet of Revelation, which we would assume is the last trumpet being talked about here, aside from any of the finer details, the 7th angel sounded, and there were loud voices in heaven saying, the kingdom of the world has become the kingdom of our Lord and of his Messiah, and he will reign forever and ever. Revelation 11:15. So seemingly, at the last trumpet, or 7th trumpet, planet Earth becomes personal property of Yeshua the Messiah. So to me, I've always looked at these passages, well, it's pretty watertight and airtight case for a post-tribulational return. And I've conducted other studies that go into a lot of the different reasons for that. But we know that the pre-tribulation rapture theology that is so prominent in a community like ours, and it's so prominent in a great deal of American evangelicalism, it causes people to think, well, it doesn't matter how bad things get. It doesn't matter how difficult things get, because you know what? The rapture is going to happen. And I remember back in the 1990s watching 2 gentlemen, Peter and Paul Lalonde, on TBN, and they were from Canada, and they even, of course, it's kind of interesting because they had a lot of good things to say, because they thought that in the future, like on Star Trek The Next Generation and the holodeck, the Antichrist was going to use virtual reality and things to communicate his message to people. And of course, now people are talking about how Facebook is becoming meta and what that's going to, we don't know, but that was kind of interesting. But they would always say, it's not the mark of the beast until after the rapture. So if you've got to take a microchip in order to feed your family, the rapture hasn't happened, you're not going to go to hell. And I thought to myself, oh God, because you read Revelation, what happens to those who take the mark of the beast, it's not a pleasant ending for them. It's not something that you want. An eternity separate from your Creator. So why take the risk? But we know that there are a lot of people, even I'm related to people who say, look, we're going to do anything we can to keep the lights on, to have access to our accounts, to have food on the table, even if it's a microchip implant, because unless the rapture happens, it's not the mark of the beast. And those are some of the real difficult questions of the last days, because we can talk about this, oh yeah, Yeshua's returning, he's going to right all the wrongs of planet Earth. But if you believe that you're going to perhaps go through these difficult times, like many believers have gone through difficult times before us, then there are going to be decisions that have to be made, not just regarding how am I contributing to the mission of God on earth today, but what am I willing to give up now, some of the creature comforts I'm willing to give up now. I'm not talking about Starbucks, I'm not talking about pedicures, I'm not talking about, because that final time is going to be so drastic, and it's going to be so difficult that, oh yeah, I don't need that in the morning. I don't need my organic, blah blah blah, to get the day started. I can have gruel. That's okay. How are we going to alter some of our behaviors now? Should we find ourselves in that time? And just look at the past 2 years. Look at what people have had to give up the past 2 years. I can't go to my favorite restaurant. I can't go to my, without, I can't go to my, the movie theater. I can't, I'm stuck at home. Oh, I can't, and that's just a test to see how you respond. It's just a test to see, can you do without, 65-degree air conditioning? Can you do without 85-degree heat? These are just little things. What is it going to be like when, my iPhone isn't working? I can't, post anything to Instagram. Oh, it's like, actually, I think a lot of us are at the point, how the hell do I get off of Instagram? How do I get off of these things? But a lot of people, that's where all of their life is. And I know this summer I was praying to the Lord. I said, what would it be like for people if all of a sudden they had no internet, they had no social media? What kind of a chemical withdrawal would they go through? I mean, that's what I think people don't recognize. Those are the real difficult matters as you contemplate the last days, because when you go read certain things or watch certain things, there's a chemical reaction that takes place and you feel good. It's like, I've got 1,000 thumbs up, or I've got so many likes, and that's what people live on. But yet that's not life. That's not living. This, what we're doing here, interacting in person, physical human beings, this is life. This is reality. And that's something that I know we have to recapture, regardless of what happens in the next few months, in the next year, in the next 10 years, regardless of what happens, we've got to recapture this kind of living as brothers and sisters, interacting in person together, and lifting up one another, and seeking the Lord for His will. Okay, so we've just gone through a brief overview of the Olivet Discourse, Matthew 24. Indeed, I shared some things I wasn't anticipating, but I guess that's just how God works. And we had 2 broad questions for discussion that will guide our conversation. Have you ever focused your attention on prophecy around the Olivet Discourse, like focusing your attention on Yeshua's teaching around his Sermon on the Mount? So the Olivet Discourse serves as the nexus point for all these other prophetic things. And then the second broad question, which of the prophetic expectations seen in the Olivet Discourse concern you the most? Because it's obvious that there's some things here that are completely outside of our control, but there's other things that we can affect. So I'm now going to stop the recording so you can speak freely, and nobody will go after you for it.